Hello everyone. This video is going to be a bit different from my regular stuff. This is a full playthrough with commentary of the game Cave Story. Cave Story is the passion project of Daisuke Pixel Amaya and was developed over 5 years from 1999 to 2004, where it was then released as freeware, and in 2010 was officially localized by Nicholas. Since then, Nicholas has given Cave Story a large makeover, adding all sorts of bells and whistles to the game, such as additional modes, new music remixes, and updated graphics. I won't be looking at the additional modes in this playthrough or using the remix music, but I will be playing with the updated graphics, because as charming as the original graphics are, they can be a bit of an eyesore on bigger screens, so for the sake of the viewer and myself, I kept them on. The music I've decided to keep on the original renditions, as I think the redone music misses the mark in regards to tone. We're going to be playing on normal mode and getting the best ending, so without further ado, let's get started. Right off the bat, we're thrust into a cutscene where a man named Kazuma is trying to IM chat with someone named Sue. He's escaped from somewhere and is trying to check if she's alright. One thing I like about this exchange is that Kazuma doesn't end most of his sentences with a period, like me. After that little cutscene, we're thrust right into the action. We play as Mr. Traveler, a robot with no memory of his past. This too will be elaborated on. Within seconds of booting up the game, you can tell that Pixel loved Metroid. There's even a familiar jingle when picking up health upgrades. Another possible reference to Metroid is the defiance of side-scroller norms by making you go left instead of right to progress. If you try to go right, you'll reach a wall of blocks that need to be destroyed by the Polar Star, the gun we're about to pick up. Sadly, we get our first gun by robbing it blind from a sleeping old man, but hey, gotta start somewhere. Then we're cut off for a moment with another quick vignette from Kazuma. I don't think the game ever does another hard cut like this again. We do find out that Sue is Kazuma's sister from this one though, which is something to keep in mind shortly. The Polar Star is your first gun and definitely most simple. No gimmicks with this one, which makes it a good all-purpose weapon. Its biggest flaw is that it's pitiful until you level it up. Cave Story takes some inspiration from role-playing games with this system. When you defeat enemies, they have a chance of spawning those yellow triangles that bounce around. When picked up, those fill the yellow meter on your HUD. When it reaches the end, it levels up the gun, making it slightly stronger. Most weapons can level up twice before maxing out. This mechanic also incentivizes not getting hit, as if you are, your weapon XP will decrease, even leveling down if it's too low. Overall, I like this mechanic, as it makes you a little more aware of your surroundings and assures you that you won't face roll everything. Although I gotta say, it's a bit disheartening to be fighting a boss and all of a sudden a rogue shot gimps your primary weapon. We defeat the deadly door and get one final vignette from Kazuma. This won't be the last we see of the guy, but it will be the last of one of these cutscenes. We're sprinkled a little more story with this exchange between King and Toriko. Their people, known as Mimiga, are being taken away by a man known as the Doctor, and Sue is somehow involved. We don't really get to see this come to a head though, since we come crashing through. Before doing anything else, we can check up on King, who shows us that looks can be deceiving. When I first played this game and saw King, I pegged him for a villain, but he's actually a pretty decent guy. His whole motivation is wanting to make sure that Mimiga Village and its inhabitants are safe, which is why he wants Sue gone, as she's jeopardizing the village's safety with her presence. Mimiga Village serves as the game's primary hub. You'll be coming back here a lot for a multitude of reasons. Excluding the save room, there's 7 different places you can enter from here. That said, there isn't really a lot to do in these areas. There's usually one NPC to talk to, and one thing to do depending on where you are in the story, but mostly you won't see me revisiting any of these areas, except for one much later in the playthrough. Now, talking to that fisherman revealed something odd. Sue is a Mimiga, which doesn't really make a lot of sense, as Kazuma, who is definitely human, is Sue's brother. Cave Story is exceptional with the way it trickle feeds the story to you. It comes at a great pace too. Outside of a few hiccups, there's never really any huge exposition dump. Toriko takes an interest in that locket we picked up, and then proceeds to give King even more of a hard time. Dude just can't catch a break. There's not really much we can do for the guy right now, so we'll just keep going about our business and explore this village a little more. We're going to head to Yamashita Farm next. This place is actually a little more significant than it lets on, despite only containing a life capsule. The farm of Mimiga lets slip information about the red flowers, a substance that supposedly kills Mimiga when ingested. These flowers are incredibly pivotal to the story and will only get more important as we progress. One thing I'm curious about is the farm's name. I tried researching what Yamashita could possibly mean, and the only lead I got was a World War II general with the name. It also has its own music track, which always struck me as odd. Perhaps Pixel had a friend named Yamashita and wanted to pay him homage? I'm merely speculating at this point. We're gonna cut ahead a bit to where I pick up the map. Admittedly, it's an item I hardly find myself using, but I like the description that comes along with it. So long as you always maintain a sense of exploration, you will someday find the way out. That is my hope. The first part is just good advice for the game, but the "that is my hope" part really fascinates me. It makes me wonder who was it that wrote this. The large Mimiga gives a little more information on Sue. She's apparently looking for flying dragons, which I'm sure do not exist. She doesn't really give us much else, and with nowhere else to go besides the shack, we head inside. Toriko actually manages to get a hit in on me, which is kind of embarrassing, but I'll live. Unfortunately, the only way to get her to stop is to shoot her, but she recovers pretty quickly from it. Toriko elaborates a little more on the doctor, telling us that he killed her older brother. Once again though, another exchange is cut short by a third party. Enter Balrog, and shortly after him, Misery. These two are the doctor's servants who we actually saw in the opening. They're looking for Sue on the doctor's behalf and actually mistake poor Toriko for her. Fun fact, in the beta, Balrog's design was actually used as a regular enemy design. In the final game, he's one of the most recurring characters, so that's quite an upgrade if you ask me. Misery takes Toriko and leaves us with Balrog, who actually gives us the option to avoid fighting him. I always end up fighting him though anyway, as he's a pretty easy fight and results in some valuable XP triangles. Although this playthrough I didn't need them as bad, because I got my Polar Star leveled up once before the fight. But hey, the faster to level 3 the better. We give the Mimiga Jack the news about Toriko's kidnapping, and he leaves the entrance to the cemetery open for us to access. This place has been overrun by mushrooms and some strange enemy that kinda looks like Tonberry from Final Fantasy. We're gonna head to the large grave at the top, as that grave has a copy of the key Toriko was hiding from King. It's also the grave of her brother Arthur, who was lauded as a hero by the village for being a great protector. You never see Arthur, not even through flashbacks or anything, but he manages to come up a lot throughout dialogue. Every Mimiga knows who Arthur is and how great of a hero he was. With nothing else in our way, we can finally enter Arthur's house. Through a teleporter in the house, we're able to teleport ourselves to a majority of K-Story's locations. Also inside Arthur's house are some flowers at the bottom. I'll be sure to discuss this in more detail later, but I bet a few of you can infer what this could mean until then. Before doing anything else, we have to check up on the computer. From this, we discover this was the computer Kazuma was sending his message to, meaning that Sue was here and we just missed her. So with only one location set in the teleporter, it's off to the first major area of the game, the Egg Corridor. Being the first level, it only makes sense that the Egg Corridor is the most straightforward out of any area in the game. It's also devoid of instant death spikes, instead opting for a creature that moves back and forth at the bottom of the stage. Even if you decide not to pick up the life capsule, you do eventually have to head to this bottom area to progress. You saw me talking to an NPC a few seconds ago. Those are recon robots that were sent to this floating island just like us. They have the same proportions, the little antenna, and everything. You would think that they would recognize you, but they don't. We will be meeting an NPC shortly who does have a little more knowledge though. In the meantime, it's back to some shooting. It doesn't take very long until I level up my Polar Star to max. It helps that a lot of the enemies in the egg corridor are passive and are easy to take care of from a long range. The creatures that cause the most trouble are the flying enemies a little further ahead, as they can take a little more punishment and fire off a projectile. After a few moments of walking, we finally come across Sue, who's gotten into trouble with the Mimiga scientist known as Igor. Igor is obviously not in his right state of mind, and despite Sue's big talk, she's easily subdued, and it's up to us to make sure she's okay. At this time, I'd like to take a moment and discuss the overall control and feel of Cave Story. Its movement is actually fairly loose. Mr. Traveler carries a lot of momentum when landing from a jump, making precision platforming something you have to get used to. I heard some people say that the movement is different / tighter compared to the original freeware release, but I've played / bought pretty much every single version of Cave Story, even the 3DS remake, and never noticed a difference in the movement. The difference people are noticing probably comes from the increased frame rate in re-releases. You can see here that I'm having a little trouble getting this life capsule. This is usually the first real hurdle I have to cross when returning to the game, because up to this point the platforming has been inconsequential. The jump requires hitting jump right before you fall off the ledge. If you do it too early, the low ceiling will cut your jump short and you'll miss your target. The punishment for missing this jump is technically nothing, but it does cost you a bit of time if you want to repeat it. Inside the house we saw a creature known as a Cthulhu. We see a couple of these characters in different locations, but it's never explicitly said whether it's one person or a race of people. There is dialogue in an alternate story mode that suggests a certain blonde pal believes they're one person, but that's it. In any case, they seem to know a lot about your past, asking if you're a surface robot and wondering where your friend is gone. We also get the official confirmation that we've lost our memory. Little by little, more backstory is getting pieced together. A little further ahead, we come across the egg observation room. This place gives you two pretty big hints, one on how to progress further in the stage, and another in the red flower petals scattered across the bed. We can presume that since the only character from this level is Igor, that this is his bed. I'm aware I might be making this seem a little too obvious, but my first time playing this game, I didn't really notice a lot of these details. That's not all the things in this room though. This is also where you obtain the missile launcher, another nod to Metroid. In the case of both Metroid and Cave Story, I don't find myself using missiles a lot outside of certain edge cases. The missile launcher in Cave Story is one of the only weapons with ammo in the game, discouraging spamming shots lest you want to deplete your supply. Speaking of supply, you don't really get a lot of these missile upgrades over the course of the game. My max at the end of this playthrough was just under 50, and half of those are given to you at the end. They at least pack quite a bit of punch at 3rd level, but yeah, don't expect me to use these much. Cut to the end of the corridor and we come face to face with Igor. If you decided not to fight Balrog, this is the first proper boss of the game. The strategy here is simple as can be. Kite him while firing shots back, and once you can't kite anymore, simply jump over him. Your jump height is easily able to pass over him so long as he doesn't leap himself. Finally, he has an additional move where he'll fire red rings from his mouth that deal damage. This one is also simple. The red rings can be destroyed with your gun, so just spam your Polar Star and none of the rings should come close to hurting you. This shouldn't take longer than a couple pass-throughs and then he's done for. With Igor taken care of, we can finally rescue Sue, and she'll give us details on exactly what is happening around here. or not. Checking the computer screen confirms that a password is needed to hatch the egg, and with that, it's back to Mimiga Village. This routine of going from Mimiga Village to level back to Mimiga Village carries on for a little while, probably around a third of the game. I'd say this is an optimal amount of time to establish a pattern. Thankfully though, it doesn't stick around long enough for me to think it's being incredibly monotonous. Would it be better if there was a different breather area in between levels? Possibly, but that might also come at the cost of the effect of breaking the status quo later on the game has. Moving on though, and we're in the second proper level of the game, the Bushlands, or Grasslands if you're a fan of the Aeon Genesis translation. I'll be upfront and say that the Bushlands are probably my least favorite level in the game. Not due to aesthetic or music, those are both great, I'm just not a fan of the immense backtracking you have to go through in this place. Its design is an organic progression from the Egg Corridor. In the Egg Corridor, you went forward, then back, and pretty much a direct line. Whereas in the Bushlands, you have the same horizontal design, albeit a little less obvious. On top of that, you have to go back and forth a multitude of times to complete tasks as a means of getting further into the level, each of them requiring you to go a bit further each time. Speaking of monotony, this feels like that, or padding at the very least. Because of the way this level is laid out, expect a lot of cuts to streamline the experience more. We're about to get a new weapon, but I'd like to mention that I appreciate the first time we see the red spikes, it's in a controlled environment. Anyone who has picked up a controller before can probably infer that those spikes are instant death, but it's nice that Pixel added that there anyway. Now, if only there was a reason Santa had them in his house. It's also strange that he has the fireball weapon, but I'm not going to complain if he's just going to give me it. The fireball is the most unique weapon yet. Firing it shoots spheres that bounce around the ground for a while, like skipping stones across water. The fireball is admittedly a niche choice to use. Its damage output is tied with the polar star when at max level, and there's a limit to how many projectiles you can have on screen at a time. However, it really shines in areas with a lot of slopes, a place like, say, the Bushlands. It seems a little counterintuitive that the enemies you're supposed to test the fireball on bounce when hit, potentially causing your other fireballs to miss. That said, in all fairness, when the fireball is at max level, only the larger enemies can survive one shot of it. So chalk that previous point down as incentive to level up this gun ASAP. Cave Story has a decent amount of selection when it comes to weapons, but not all are created equal, and you'll probably find yourself staying on a particular gun for a majority of your playthrough. For the time that I have it, that weapon is the Polar Star. Despite it being pretty weak, it's reliable, and at this point hasn't outworn its welcome. We've come across the first roadblock of the level. We have to cross through this Mimiga Chaco's house to her fireplace, but we obviously can't pass through fire, so we gotta find a way to put it out. She tips us off that jellyfish juice should do the trick, and that there is some back the way we came. Here I also show off a funny little Easter egg you can do by resting in Chaco's house after she gives us that dialogue. We awake to her sleeping in her bed with us and her lipstick in our inventory. Does this make me a furry? The lipstick doesn't do anything, but I think it's a neat extra. Once we go back outside, all of a sudden there are jellyfish everywhere. I feel their introduction could have been handled better. There's practically no warning that these things make the Bushlands their home, and once they're talked about, they practically infest the place. Sprinkling in a few of them before this large influx could have gone a long way in making their inclusion that much less jarring. They do make a satisfying squeaking noise though. While we're doing this backtracking, I want to talk about the genre Cave Story gets called, Metroidvania. In case you're unaware, a Metroidvania is a game with a large open-ended world. This world usually becomes more accessible to the player through upgrades they unlock incrementally, leading to backtracking. With that in mind, I wouldn't recommend this game to people if they were looking for a pure Metroidvania. Does Cave Story have Metroidvania elements? Sure, but fans of the genre might come away disappointed if they were expecting a more seamless connected world and other trappings of the genre. I'd say that Cave Story is at its best when it doesn't lean on genre conventions like backtracking. And it's not like I hate backtracking or anything. Super Metroid is one of my favorite games after all. I just don't think that Cave Story pulls it off the best. But still, I'm positive most fans of the genre would still love this game, but getting preconceived notions about something, and then those notions being proven wrong, can really hamper an experience. Alright, I think I've droned on long enough. Right now, I'm going to be picking up some things preemptively that I know I'll need later on in the level to streamline my experience. When I was doing this, I actually found out that Nicholas added a quality of life change in letting you carry up to 2 jellyfish juice items. I'm not sure when they added this, as I don't remember it being there at launch, but I could have missed it then. I almost missed it this time. This helps make the Bushlands a lot more tolerable, so it's a very welcome change. We quickly take a trip back to Mimiga Village to put out the only other fireplace available to us, and our clever thinking gets us a new weapon, the Bubble Line, also known as the Bubbler. The Bubble Line is likely to be the first and possibly only weapon you come across that not only has an ammo counter which regenerates, but also fires as long as you're holding down the attack button. Its first level is remarkably pathetic, but leveling it up provides an exponential increase in quality. Like the Fireball, this is a bit of a niche pick, but it's also very satisfying to use. Having a shield of bubbles surrounding me and then releasing the button to have them fire all at once just feels great. Its damage output is weak though, and you can't aim the bubbles either, they just lazily fire off in the direction you shoot them in. Because of this, I'd say you're best off using the Bubble Line as crowd control. If there are a lot of targets, you're bound to hit something with the bubbles. A few moments later, we return to Santa's house to put out his fire and grab the remains. Don't worry, we have a reason for doing this. Then it's back to Chaco's house to finally get access to part 2 of the Bushlands. Once we leave Chaco's house, the level design for Cave Story makes a bit of a difficulty jump. Before this point, instant death was easily telegraphed in the form of the Egg Corridor enemy, or practically non-existent. There is one patch of death spikes before this point, not counting the patch at Santa's house, but it's shortly before this part anyway, and is pretty simple to dodge. This is when it gets a bit more precarious. I suppose now would be a good time to ask the question, is it okay for instant death to be so prevalent? After all, one screw up leading to death can really take the wind out of someone's sails. Personally, in the case of Cave Story, I think it's fine. Death in this game is nothing more than a slap on the wrist. As you've clearly seen, save points are just as common as instant death, so usually death only sets you back a few moments. Personally, I don't have a problem with this approach to game design, as instant death in this game is so easily telegraphed it's your own fault if you fall prey to it. I want to point out these white enemies that we were just fighting. Design-wise, they're probably one of my favorites. Unlike the other enemies we've seen before, like bats or jellyfish, these are the first enemies I can't figure out what they're supposed to be, if they're even supposed to be anything. They're also incredibly expressive. I love the face they make when they're defeated. They reminds me of Earthbound. In case you forgot, Cave Story was made by Pixel and Pixel alone, meaning he wasn't just the level designer, he was also the character designer, composer, everything. And it's absolutely incredible he managed to pull all this off. Praise also has to be given to the team at Nicholas. After all, this is the remastered graphics, and those are their doing. We just picked up the rusted key from Kazuma. Yes, that Kazuma. Unfortunately for him, this key doesn't go to his locked room, but rather the door we passed by earlier, the power supply room. You probably noticed the fans scattered throughout the Bushlands by now. Well, taking a trip to this room should allow us to power them on, which will mean much more exploring can be done. Unfortunately, a byproduct of turning them on means we also turn on the deadly robot Malco. Malco marks the biggest jump in difficulty yet and is by far the hardest boss in the game. Nah, just kidding, we're really just treated to another meeting with Balrog. The doctor isn't very happy that him and Misery nabbed the wrong Mimiga, and is gonna try and take it out on us. Thankfully, just like last time, he's pretty easy. Since I have level 3 missiles, I decided to show off just how destructive they can be. Despite me not liking it, I understand why these things have an ammo counter. If you don't have the missile reserves, don't fret, Balrog goes down just as easily by being pelted with fireballs, which is actually pretty fitting considering the level we're in. And with that, just as soon as he arrived, he's gone. Before we head out though, let's help our robot brethren. Melko's bomb skills will come in handy shortly, but for now, we're gonna put a pin in this and do a little exploring. Now that the fans are all activated, we can access a lot more of the Bushlands. It also means that if we want to go back and forth from part 1 to part 2 of the Bushlands, we won't have to keep putting out Chaco's fireplace, as there's a conveniently placed fan right before the house that lets us hop right over it. We also get access to the suspiciously empty house. Inside is a missile tank, which is nice, but what isn't nice is the rabid Mimiga hiding in the fireplace. I'm sure you noticed the red flower petals scattered across the bed. There's no real reason being coy anymore about this. The red flowers don't kill Mimiga, rather it turns them into rage-induced killers. Now, what I'm curious about is how these Mimigas are getting access to the red flowers. Obviously, the Mimiga from the village think that the flowers kill them, but that might not be the case for the folks who live in the Bushlands or the Egg Corridor. My only theory is that it's the doctor, but as far as I know, there's nothing supporting that in the game. And with that, fitting the name of the area, my first death in the game is probably my most embarrassing. I'm not really sure what I was trying to do here. That'll be the end of our exploring for now, and we return to the bomb conversation. Our character, Mr. Traveler, comes to the conclusion that the best course of action would be to bomb the door. The ingredients for the bomb are as follows: charcoal, jellyfish juice, and gum base. Thanks to my preemptive backtracking, we've already crossed 2 of those items off the list. The last item has to be obtained by heading to the way end of the level and heading inside the gum room. This room has those tricky fans that you have to rely on to push you the whole way across. It can be a little frustrating to figure out how they work, but before you know it, you'll be in the room. Because I was busy talking about something else the last time she showed up, now would be a decent time to talk about Misery. She's another one of the servants of the Demon Crown, but unlike Balrog, she's clearly the brains of the two and seems to have access to quite the powerful array of spells. She falls for the trap a lot of villains do though, by sending her lackey to do the dirty work. This time though, she makes Balrog much more of a challenge. Balfrog is what I would consider the first major boss of the game. Igor and the Balrog fights prior were pretty damn easy, so it's almost like they were a warm-up for this fight. I think what makes him so challenging is how he can only be damaged when his mouth is open. Spamming the fire button won't work this time, so you have to be a little more methodical in your approach and time your hits correctly. Even when his mouth is open, it's hard to land decent hits because of the projectiles he fires. There's also his size. He's the largest enemy we've faced yet, and because of this, he's hard to avoid. The fans are meant to send you over him, but I find that's easier said than done. Missiles are the best weapon to use against him, as they're the only weapon which will hit him while you're at ground level. Make sure to do crowd control on the enemies though to keep supplies up. Keeping to the strategy should lead to an eventual victory. With all of the supplies gathered, the bomb is built, and we can finally spring our rescue attempt. Thankfully, it goes off without a hitch. It's a good feeling finally getting inside this room that we've seen since the beginning of the game, and not only do we free Kazuma, but we also meet another character. Professor Booster is another member of the research group. He seems to pretend not to know who we are, but this actually gets payoff sooner than you would expect. This scene always stuck out to me. I suppose Pixel wanted a good excuse for how Booster and Cosma got through the Bushlands, but still, kinda odd. But it's also pretty funny, so whatever. We just received our longest info dump yet, but it's mostly comprised of things I've already brought up before. There is the payoff of Booster's suspicious behavior though, however it's nothing mind-blowing. We're practically recruited to assist in stopping the Doctor, with escaping the island being temporarily put on the back burner. The Doctor has discovered the location of the red flowers, so we gotta head over to their whereabouts first before we can get them, so it's off to the sand zone. A few steps into the new level and we already encounter something peculiar, an NPC that isn't a Mimiga. We'll be meeting her shortly, but her name is Curly Brace, and despite only showing up now, she's probably the most important NPC in the game. She's definitely the most popular, that's for sure. She's a lot like Mr. Traveler here. She's a robot who has lost her memory. I call her an NPC, but that's not entirely true. Once you meet her, you actually unlock a mode to play through the campaign as her in Case Story Plus. The story is practically the same, aside for a few changes into the dialogue, but if you're a fan of Curly, that'd be something worth checking out. Curly is suspicious of us, so she gets hostile and we have to defend ourselves. Since Curly never jumps in this fight, the fireball ends up making short work of her. The challenge of the fight isn't necessarily avoiding her, but the 4 Mimiga she has backing her up. With them being taken down in one hit though, even that doesn't provide much of a challenge, and she's defeated before she knows it. All of a sudden, we're given an opportunity to trade in the Polar Star for Curly's machine gun. This is actually a pretty big decision, even if most don't realize it their first time playing. I choose not to take the machine gun, and it's for a pretty good reason that'll become apparent in a while. Basically, we want to hold on to our Polar Star for as long as we can, and for this diligence, we shall be rewarded. Now, that isn't to say the machine gun is bad by any means. It outpaces the Polar Star in damage, fires pretty damn fast, and best of all, at level 3, can propel you upwards or downwards depending on where you aim your bullets. This level 3 ability is why I would recommend, if this is your first time playing Cave Story, you should probably trade in your Polar Star for this. The biggest drawback regarding the machine gun is the ammo. It's the only other weapon besides the bubble line that has rechargeable ammunition, and unlike the bubble line, which recharges fairly fast, the machine gun has a considerably slower recharge rate. There is an upgrade you can pick up later that mitigates this a bit, but it's still a drag. The dog will be explained later. For now, we have bigger fish to fry with another encounter with Misery. We get teased with the idea of fighting her head on, but she's interrupted by the real boss fight. Omega is a boss I always forget about on repeat playthroughs. He's unremarkable in a lot of aspects, piss easy, and doesn't really have any lore relevance. He just exists as a roadblock to be beaten. Like a lot of bosses, it's best to pump him with missiles until your stock is depleted, and then get up close and use the fireball. After rewatching this footage, maybe I should reconsider my stance on the fireball being niche. It seems to be a lot better than I give it credit for. I didn't really get a chance to talk about how I feel about the Sand Zone due to Curly Brace, so I'll discuss my thoughts on it now. I used to sort of dislike the Sand Zone before, but this time ended up not minding it as much. Of course, it used to be a lot more backtrack heavy in previous releases, and with the Switch release of the game, Nicholas decided to cut a lot of that backtracking out. The dogs I'm currently grabbing are required to progress to the end of the stage. These dogs belong to a lady named Jenka, and she has 5 little pups. What Nicholas changed in this version was the ability to hold on to more than one dog at a time, meaning you don't have to go back and forth from Jenka's house to the whereabouts of another dog. It's like the jellyfish juice situation earlier, except this time for a much larger stretch of backtracking. As far as I'm aware, the changes Nicholas made to the game have been received well by the community, and I'm thankful because I think they did a really good job in this regard. When companies make changes to existing games for the sake of a better experience, I and many others tend to proceed with caution. It's real easy to screw something up and ruin the game for fans. But all the changes Nicholas provided toe that line well. These changes, especially the backtracking ones, allow me to think about the other aspects of the levels like Sand Zone, when before I would have been hung up on dog collecting. It wasn't until this playthrough that I realized Sand Zone is the first level to really introduce verticality. We had some in the Mimiga Village, but that's a hub world, not something I consider a full-fledged level. Bushlands also had a little bit of this, but then again, it wasn't anything major. Right from the start of the level, we're treated to a vertical shaft we have to climb, and afterwards are treated to more conventional horizontal level design. Verticality admittedly isn't something Cave Story uses a lot, which makes it sticks out when it's used. I can understand why Pixel would mostly shy away from having more vertical sections of the game, but I think it would have been nice to see some more outside of the 2 major vertical sections after Sand Zone. While we're on the subject of underutilized mechanics in Cave Story, let me just say I'm glad that Pixel didn't pursue these dark rooms any further than he did. More footage than I'm comfortable saying got cut from that section. The next dog requires you to be a little patient. It's best to just wait for him to come to you rather than the other way around, especially since it can be hard to actually catch him while you're moving. My mind blanked on catching the 5th dog before speaking to Jenka, so I'm afraid you all won't be able to witness the 5-dog stack. Sorry about that. There was quite a bit to unpack from that scene. The most important information I found from that exchange as a repeat player is Balrog referring to Jenka as his aunt. Balrog is clearly not human, which Jenka and Misery appear to be, so it makes me wonder, well, who are Balrog's parents? Well, before rampant speculation begins, I feel it necessary to nip this one in the bud. Balrog only refers to Jenka as his aunt in the Nicholas translation. Still, would like an answer about Balrog's origin though. We do get a little more information about the island from Jenka the more dogs we give her. Admittedly, getting all the information at once does feel a tad jarring as opposed to getting it piece by piece, but it's not the end of the world and is a fair trade for making the game much less of a slog. Another thing I picked up on while reading Jenka's dialogue is when she mentions the red flowers affecting Mimiga. She says that they disappeared after eating them. Obviously, from first-hand experience, we know that the original story about what happens to Mimiga who eat red flowers wasn't necessarily true, but with Jenka unsure of what happened to the Mimiga after consuming the flowers, it's possible that the original story wasn't 100% a lie and could have been some sort of half-truth. Of course, it's just as, if not more likely, that the story she gave about the Mimiga reaching the surface is the case, but it's still something to speculate over. A quick jump ahead and we're back at Curly Brace's house to pick up the final dog, and if we also do a bit of finagling, we can come across another useless item akin to Chaco's Rouge. Yeah, you can find Curly's panties. I honestly find it interesting that Pixel decided to add this into the game. A bit of a horn dog move, but I'll be giving him no will for the decision. We can see that the dogs have unique names in the inventory screen, which is also a nice touch. When all of Jenka's dogs are returned, you have to head away from her house for a moment, which will trigger a cutscene. Before you ask, don't worry, the rest of the dogs are safe, I promise. Right now, we have a larger problem in Balrog getting access to the red flowers, but before we deal with that, we're given a gift from Jenka. The life pot is a one-time use item which fully restores your HP. You only get 2 of these throughout your playthrough, so it's best to save it for a special occasion. We'll be holding on to ours for a little while. A quick aside, one of the dogs you had to get before was originally at the entrance of the warehouse, but was changed in the switchboard. In this cutscene, we get our first real appearance of the Doctor. Unfortunately, we were too late, and he's gotten his hands on the red flowers. Whatever that entails for his greater plans is yet to be seen, but it does result in one of the more gut-wrenching scenes in the game. King appears to try and rescue Toriko, but he's also too late. And this would be a better time than ever to bring up King's eyes. Like the enraged Mimiga, King's eyes are red, but unlike the enraged Mimiga, he's completely lucid. At first I just chalked this up to coincidence, but upon doing further research, according to Pixel himself, King consumed the red flowers, which is how he, and possibly Arthur before him, got to be so strong. How did King not become rabid like the rest of them? Well, Pixel says, and I quote, he may have cooked them. Definitely a bit of a cheeky response, but this is still information that isn't in the game. But even King's increased strength couldn't stand up to the Doctor, and we're left with the rabid Toriko to take down. Toriko is actually a bit of a tricky fight if you're not careful. The blocks that she hurls at you deal 10 damage each, so if you can avoid being hit by them, even if it means being hit by another attack, do it. Since the flowers she creates only deal 1 damage, it's always better to just tank the hit from the flower if it means avoiding a block. This fight is a good demonstration for why beginners should take the machine gun. Since Toriko has a large health pool, she can be a bit of a slog to take down. A consistent damage dealer like the machine gun would greatly increase the speed in which Toriko is defeated. The Polar Star really starts to show its age around this point in the game. Missiles, as always, deal good damage, but the blocks Toriko throws would have made them a little too hard to land. The damage I was taking reverted the Polar Star down to its pitiful level 1 state, so I had to resort to using the Fireball, which worked alright so long as Toriko stood still. And so, in the longest fight in the game yet, Toriko is defeated. Thankfully, the boss defeated music that would have killed the mood right now decides not to show up. King also succumbs to his injuries, but not before giving us the blade, his final wish being that we avenge him. Before we can head back to Mimiga Village, we're caught by Balrog and Misery.
Sick of our meddling, she decides to banish us to the Labyrinth, also sending Balrog along with us due to his incompetence in the past. And with this event, we're thrust into the second act of Cave Story. The Labyrinth is the beginning of the rest of the game, if that makes any sense. What I mean by that is at this point Cave Story drops the pattern of Mimiga Village to level and back I mentioned earlier, and it's also at this point that when I first played this game, my opinion of it increased dramatically. The plot of the game has fully gone underway. There's legitimate stakes now. King and Toriko are dead, the Doctor has the red flowers, and we still don't know exactly who we are outside of some generalizations. Before, the story wasn't really driving me. The gameplay was carrying everything. But from now on, the scales are much more balanced. Despite its name, the Labyrinth isn't really much of a maze, at least when it comes to level design. In fact, once we're out of this vertical section, it's practically a straight shot until the end of the level. It's a labyrinth in the sense that escape is difficult to find. Honestly though, would anybody actually want a maze level in this game? I know I wouldn't. While the name might not complement the level design, I still think that this is one of the best levels in the game, because it ends up delivering on all fronts. Lore-wise, it's clear from not only Misery's demeanor when she sends you here, but also from the other robots scattered about that this probably isn't the first time something has been banished to this place. Something we'll see confirmed by an NPC shortly. One touch I like about this beginning section of the Labyrinth is how it has the same backing track as Jenka's house. It not only fits the mood nicely, but also connects us back to Jenka and Misery. Then there's the level design itself, which, while not being 100% faithful to the name, manages to cram in everything we've learned about thus far and crank it up a notch. We just passed our longest stretch of vertical platforming yet. The game is getting a little more tenacious with its death traps, and the enemies are about to become more plentiful and deadlier than ever. A few screens into the Labyrinth and we receive a remix of Jenka's theme, and it's absolutely incredible, capturing the feeling of climbing out of the depths to exact revenge wonderfully. And with this feeling in mind, there's no better weapon to use than the blade we got from King before he died. The blade is a unique weapon. For one, it's not a gun, but if you were expecting a melee weapon, you would be half right. The blade is thrown like a projectile, and when it hits an enemy, it deals a massive amount of damage. 15 to be exact. To put that into perspective, that's dead in the center range of damage output from the level 2 missiles and 11 more damage than the Polar Star at its maximum power. The drawbacks to this weapon are apparent though. For one, this weapon is an absolute experience sponge. Thankfully, there are a lot of enemies in the Labyrinth, otherwise this thing would be a pain to level up. Second off, you can only have one projectile out at a time. This second problem can be curbed fairly well if you stand close to your enemies when you fire the weapon, as the travel time will be reduced significantly and you'll be ready to fire it again once it hits an enemy. This is the secret of the blade. When you're right up against an enemy, you can inflict massive damage on them this way, especially at level 2. It also feels like the intended way to use the weapon. After all, it is a sword, right? It only makes sense it would be the most useful in melee. There was a proposition from one of the cockroach creatures, aka Gaudy, asking to trade our Polar Star and Fireball for another weapon. This weapon is called the Snake, and we're going to once again pass on trading in our Polar Star and instead being a little more patient. The Snake is the only weapon in the game that can go through walls, which is cool, but pales in comparison to what else we can get. I feel kinda bad for the Snake though. It comes too late to be helpful for newbies, and experienced players know to hold on to their Polar Stars. Stopping by this house, we find Curly Brace in a less than ideal situation. She got banished to the Labyrinth by Misery too, except her injuries were more severe than ours. Since we're friends though, we're gonna help her out and pick up the medicine in the old clinic nearby. On our way to the clinic though, we're gonna farm the Gaudy until we can level up our blade to level 3. Even with all of these enemies, it still takes a little bit to reach max level. And the best part is, when it's at max level, all it takes is one hit for it to be de-leveled again. You really want to hold on to this though. The level 3 blade completely changes the melee strategy of the first 2 levels, instead having the soul of King fly out from the sword, slashing everything around him for a few seconds. This ability was hinted at in the weapon's description, but it's a real treat to actually see it. You're sacrificing the DPS from the previous 2 levels, but I think it more than makes up for it in crowd control. Definitely a keeper. We also just picked up an optional item called the Arms Barrier. This neat little item cuts the amount of experience we lose when getting hit by an enemy in half. We still lose our level 3 sword in one hit, but at least it'll be easier to reach max level again. Once inside the old clinic, we can find the cure-all item, proudly on display, but of course it wasn't going to be that easy. This boss's name is Pooh Black, and no, you're not seeing things. It is the spitting image of Balrog, but as far as I know, there's no reason for this in-universe. All I could find is that its name is a reference to Balrog's beta name, Pooh, hence why it is called Pooh Black. But still, it's strange that there's no connection to the two, and no, this guy isn't that hard despite how I'm making it look. The hardest part about this fight is the arena. It's the most cramped fight in the game. To compensate, Pooh Black only has one real move, hiding for a few seconds, then jumping down on top of you at the last moment. Wait around for the dark orbs to appear, and then start moving. Then wail on it with the blade. It shouldn't take long before that does it in. We hand the medicine over to the doctor, and Curly will be feeling fine in no time. Not really sure how medicine works on a robot, but hey, as long as she starts to feel better, who am I to complain?
Now that we've dealt with Curly, we can move on and continue progressing through the labyrinth. There's another boss coming up soon, and with the last save being at the clinic, we want to make sure we end up relatively healthy for it. That moving block section makes this easier said than done though. If you end up getting hit by the red spikes, you're honestly better off just resetting and trying again. It's very avoidable damage, and like I said, you want to be in tip-top shape for this next fight. Monster X is the boss I used to end up spending my life pot on because of how much trouble it gave me. It's only vulnerable when its center opens up and fires projectiles, meaning you can use all your brain power on dodging when it's not open. The best strategy to avoid being hit by the treadmill legs are by standing on top of one of them, then jumping off when it's about to reach the end of an arena. Or if you're feeling risky, like me, just jump off as soon as you land on one. Just be careful when jumping from one leg to another. The momentum of the boss makes jumping physics wonky and can easily trip you up and make you under or overshoot a jump. If that happens, make sure that you don't touch the treads. They deal 10 damage, which is just under a quarter of your expected maximum HP. When the center opens up, make sure to use the blade, since its high DPS and or crowd control is crucial to making this fight go as swimmingly as possible. Swarming can also be a huge problem if left alone. The level 3 blade really helps with this regard, as its area of effect usually stops the swarming projectiles from even materializing. After some wailing, Monster X is defeated and is revealed to be a house cat of all things. Like Pooh Black, I'm not really sure why this thing is a cat, but I suppose it doesn't really matter. It's clearly intended to be a gag, so I probably shouldn't be looking too deep into it. Now, conventional wisdom would tell us that we should probably jump down there and help Professor Booster, seeing as he's clearly in need of it. But you actually want to ignore Booster completely. Talking to him reveals that you're close to the heart of the island. He then succumbs to his injuries, but not before giving you the Booster 0.8. The Booster 0.8 is a neat item that gives you a quick burst of air after you jump. The problem is though, taking the Booster 0.8 locks you out of getting the best ending in the game. Ignoring him allows him to live another day, setting off a chain of events that allow you to get the best ending. This is frequently brought up as Cave Story's biggest misstep, but I'm going to play devil's advocate for a bit and try to explain the reasoning behind this decision. There's no avoiding the fact that most people wouldn't hesitate to check up on Booster, but I believe that was the point. Throughout the adventure, there's been a trend of decisions where you can choose to gain something in the short term or long term, like the machine gun for example. This moment is no different. The Booster 0.8 is an extremely helpful item to have for an upcoming boss fight, but this assistance comes at the cost of losing out on the best ending. Pixel expected players to do this. He also expected people to play through his game multiple times.
Your first playthrough, you're going to want to have the booster sooner rather than later, but on subsequent playthroughs, you'd get better at the game and not need to use it. At the end of the game, there's a notebook written by the professor that you can find, hinting that, should he get the time, he can make the booster even greater. This is meant to be a clue to first-time players that there's more to be done with the professor. That said, I feel this could have been executed much better. I'd be lying if I said I figured out how to get the best ending in the game without a guide. But that also might have partly been what Pixel expected players to do. It's no secret that he likes older games, and a lot of those games strongly encouraged getting a guide to figure out what to do since they were so obtuse. There's an article talking about this specific choice in Cave Story, and these types of discussions as a whole in the description that I think is worth reading. Also worth reading is Matt W's comment/rebuttal to the article in its comment section. Before we move on from this, I wanted to point out two things. One being that Pixel places a red dot on the block where you jump to give players a clue on how to pass that seemingly impossible jump without the booster. Another is that the Switch version gave you a choice in taking the booster, making the punishment for failing the aforementioned jump less severe. I didn't take advantage of this because I wasn't aware of this change when recording my playthrough. Oops. My rattling on about the booster made me ignore the Balrog fight that just happened. To be honest though, the fight itself isn't anything spectacular, but what is interesting is the little change of heart Balrog shows in actually helping you out. This is also where we get a damage upgrade for our missiles. Right after that section, we're treated to a pretty drastic change, and I'm not just talking about the music. This stretch of the Labyrinth is pure run and gun, even giving us some extra firepower in the form of an AI-controlled Curly. I felt that this was the best opportunity to show off one of the biggest additions Nicholas added to the Switch version of Cave Story, local cooperative play. My main reason for wanting to try the co-op out here was to see if it disabled the AI partner, but that proved not to be the case. Can't say I blame them though, adding the feature in the first place must have been a pain in the ass considering it was released a few months after launch. Even as it is right now, it's incredibly novel to be playing this game that I've played countless times before with someone else. I'm not sure I could see myself exploring this much more than I already have though. Obviously Cave Story wasn't meant to be played like this, and it shows. One thing that's a real bummer is that when player 2 dies, it counts as a death for you as well, essentially doubling your chance of dying. I do think the co-op is something worth trying out if you're a veteran of Cave Story and are looking for something to spice up another playthrough. The amount of characters available to play as is staggering as well. As you saw in the corner throughout the game, I've been unlocking them as I play. I'm sure someone would get a kick out of finally being able to play as Sue. This area is quite the gauntlet, but there's actually an in-universe reason for this. As I said earlier, we're closing in on the core of the island. The core is something that is best left undisturbed, so it only makes sense that there would be a horde of enemies protecting it. There's even dialogue spoken from one of the Gotti that implies that these defensive measures were Jenka's doing. It's only a matter of time though before we end up reaching the end of it. There's a definite ambience about this area. I think it helps significantly that it's placed right after one of the most intense sections of the game yet, contrasting with it very nicely. The track that plays here, Geothermal, is also quite moody and a personal favorite of mine. Before heading straight to the core, we have to open up several blast doors. I know it was mentioned that Jenka is responsible for placing the Gotti to defend the core, but I don't think it's ever brought up whose idea the blast doors were. Technology doesn't fit Jenka or Misery. Considering one of the doors gets stuck, it's safe to assume that these are pretty old. So my loose theory is that one of the previous owners of the Demon Crown installed these, as the wielder of the Demon Crown has a vested interest in making sure that the core stays safe for reasons that'll be apparent shortly. Quick aside, we swapped characters on player 2 as having two curly braces running around was getting to be a bit confusing. Before we can get the final blast door open, we have to head to a computer that's just past a large body of water. Water has been placed pretty sparingly throughout this game up to this point, but the upcoming fight is about to make a lot of use of it. This little section right before the fight itself is meant to be used as a warning to get used to the water while you can. All of these steps and detours you have to take before you can enter the core proper keeps building up the tension, and the slow movement through the water makes it almost unbearable. It's also interesting to note that at this moment we still don't even know what the core looks like. All of the suspense is bound to make your mind run wild with ideas. Once you finally get access to the room, you wouldn't be blamed if you went straight to Curly just to finally get to the bottom of this place. But if you didn't save Professor Booster, then you can find a glowing item on the floor of the bottom right. This glowing item is the tow rope, an item that lets you carry robots on your back. At this moment, this item is useless, but it'll soon become one of the most important items in the game, so if you die during the upcoming battle, be extremely sure that you pick this item up again. The robots scattered throughout the core room tells us that at one point in time, this place got raided by the surface robots sent here years ago. This is perhaps why the blast doors were installed. One of the robots is still semi-functional, but doesn't last much longer after talking to it. I think out of all the mugshots in the game, this robot has by far the creepiest one. The core might just be the hardest fight in the game if you have the loadout I have. Like Monster X before, the core can only be damaged when its weak point is exposed. The problem with that is the core is protected by these little mini cores that take the hits for it. This makes missiles less than ideal since you're more than likely going to waste ammo trying to hit the core rather than actually hitting it. The fireball is almost useless in this fight, and the bubble line suffers from a similar problem that the missiles do. The Polar Star has the best range, but it's long outlasted its usefulness by this point, which leaves me with the Blade, which deals good damage but makes it hard to land hits due to its short range. Because of my limited range, I'm trying to get as close to the thing as possible, but the layout of the arena makes that quite tough. I'm focusing everything I can on attempting to land hits that I don't bother trying to dodge a lot of the attacks sent my way. Sadly, for our player 2, she drowns due to being underwater too long and it's game over. With this fight being as difficult as it is, we both decided that it'd be better if I tackled this one alone. Thanks for helping me out though, sis. Player 2 did show off one of the most dangerous things about this fight, and that's the rising tide. When underwater, you only have a little over 15 seconds before you instantly die. Between that short amount of time and how long it takes to reach higher ground, drowning actually becomes one of the more common ways to die fighting the core. For this reason, you want to stay as high as you can while still dealing damage to the core. If you're flung to the bottom of the arena, and trust me, you will be, immediately book it to the left and keep jumping against the blast door until the tide falls. Depending on when the tide rose though, even this might result in death. However, it's less common. This fight is that special occasion the first life pot of the playthrough is saved for. This is probably the best time to use it as there isn't any part from now until the time where you get the second life pot that sticks out to me as harder. Curly is attempting to help us with the fight, but her AI can only do so much. She'll end up getting a couple hits in, but she's pretty much just there for moral support. I come half a second away from drowning, but thankfully was able to save myself just in time. Ideally, I would avoid damage and keep my blade at its third level, but the amount of spam being sent out makes that quite the task. The core can also send you flying towards the blast door if you haven't noticed. This prevents you from camping out in front of the core the entire fight, and also can discombobulate you. If the tide is up when this happens, it can make dodging the core's energy ball attack incredibly hard. The energy balls deal an incredible 20 damage, the highest amount out of any non-lethal damage dealt by a single attack. With a sliver of health remaining, I decide to go in for the kill and, ironically, end up finishing the job with the useless Polar Star. Misery teleports the core away, presumably so the doctor can find some way to salvage it and keep the island floating. They leave me to drown in the core room, though. If we grab the tow rope, we're given this snippet of lore explaining that Jenka has a brother named Balos. This revelation sparks a lot of intrigue for the player, but I'm curious if this message is meant to be given to the player or the character. If it's the latter, who's giving him this information? Miraculously, though, we're saved in the last minute by a selfless act from Curly. This is where the tow rope comes in. If you didn't pick up this item, then you can't take her out of the core room and rescue her. This moment is incredibly cruel if you grab the booster 0.8. Seeing Curly's lifeless body lay in the water next to the dozens of other dead robots gives me a terrible feeling. The blast door closing behind you afterwards in the scenario is like twisting the knife. But just because we got her out of the core room doesn't mean she's safe yet. We need to find a way to get the water out of her system. If we're too slow, she'll shut down permanently. The door leading to the labyrinth won't open anymore, leaving us with only one option, the lion's head. Going through the head splits us out into the waterway. The music that plays here is a dour tune fitting in the situation. Unlike avoiding helping the professor, I think the remainder of this mini-quest is fairly easy to figure out. There's no reason why the tow rope only shows up if you don't help the professor, but your eyes are more than likely going to be drawn to the sparkles and investigate. When Curly gives you her air tank, you're more than likely going to attempt to interact with her to make sure she's okay. Then you're more than likely going to take her along with you in some attempt to rescue her as well. Like I said earlier, this is a race against time. If you stand around with her on your back for too long, you'll get a message saying that Curly has died. The currents that push you around underwater are clearly meant as a way to get the player to float around aimlessly in circles, wasting time and ensuring that Curly will die. Holding jump at the right time and influencing your direction goes a long way in making sure that this doesn't happen to you. And before we know it, we find a house where we can do something about that water and Curly. Inside the Waterway cabin is where we can drain the water out of Curly. Before we do anything in here, we have to rest on the bed so she can be placed on it. Afterwards, it's really just a matter of investigating every area of interest until we're given some sort of lead. This lead comes from the computer, pointing us in the direction of a notebook on one of the bookshelves. If you check out the bookshelf before the computer, you'll get dialogue about a notebook, but since Mr. Traveler doesn't know if it's of any importance, he doesn't investigate further. After checking out the computer though, returning to the notebook shows that it's miraculously a guide on how to drain robots. Quickly returning to Curly, we fade to black to begin the process. It proves to be a success and she awakes from her stupor. Only temporarily, however, and it's on to the next step of the quest. There's nothing else we can do in the cabin, so it's time to move on. Investigating the computer once more, though, will give us another message similar to the one from the map system, in that it seems to be talking to the player rather than the character. I think most people's knee-jerk reaction to this next decision would be to let Curly stay in the safe area until she recovers while we move on. Which is why I think it was a good idea to have the option be when you interact with her, not take her with you, but rather leave her here. The latter sounds much more cold, so answering no almost feels like second nature. We traverse through the remainder of the waterway and find ourselves fighting the fish Ironhead. This is probably the most unique fight in the game, as it's the only one where you fight completely underwater. Due to the physics of this fight, it almost plays out like a shoot-'em-up boss. I wouldn't say Ironhead is particularly hard, but he is pretty tough if you're trying to beat him without getting hurt. The fish that fly in front of Ironhead don't hurt you until they turn white, so until that happens, you only need to focus on dodging the scattered blocks in Ironhead. The level 3 blade works wonders in this fight. Its scattered shots not only deal constant passive damage to Ironhead, but also clear the path of any nearby porcupine fish, meaning all you have to do while this happens is dodge. Before you know it, Ironhead is defeated, and when you defeat him without getting hurt, a swarm of octopus swim across the screen. However, Curly also gets separated from us while this happens. We're also stealthily given the alien medal for beating Ironhead with no damage. That whole fight was actually a reference to Pixel's previous game, Ika-chan. Due to our actions, the professor is alive and was able to complete the Booster 2.0. He gives it to us, requesting that we find Sue and get her off this island before things get even worse. Like the professor said, all the Mimiga here have been taken by the doctor at this point, leaving Mimiga Village a ghost town. It's been a while since we've last been here, so seeing this place so dead is quite unsettling. I think what most people did when first getting the Booster 2.0 was attempt to return to where the game first started, and if they did that while still holding onto the Polar Star, then they were rewarded handsomely. Holding onto the Polar Star finally pays off by trading it for the spur. Before I go rattling on about the spur though, I want to highlight this last bit of dialogue from the gunsmith. I don't have any proof for this, but I'm positive that those lines are coming directly from Pixel and is his worldview on creatives and consumers. I don't think this is the first time Pixel has broken the fourth wall either. I believe he did the exact same thing with the map dialogue, and more recently the Waterway computer dialogue. Those little moments are one of the reasons that makes this game so special. You can tell Pixel genuinely cared. Now, the spur is regarded as the ultimate weapon in this game, and it's easy to see why. The experience system is completely ditched for this weapon, instead changing it to a charging mechanic, leveling up and making the attack stronger as you hold down the fire button. If fired accurately, this beam can absolutely annihilate enemies, even going through them if charged up enough. When you get the spur, the amount of enemies in the first cave increase exponentially so you can play around with the gun and just mindlessly tear through multiple enemies at a time like tissue paper. I think the best part about the spur is that it isn't restricted by the leveling mechanic, meaning the worry of getting your weapon de-leveled at an inconvenient time is now gone. I don't think that the leveling mechanic is bad, mind you, but I do think that a good reward for holding on to an underpowered gun for over half the game is sidestepping this mechanic. Not to mention, it's not like there isn't something to counteract this change. The charge time wait for a max level shot from the spur is several seconds spent not firing it at all. I got a little carried away talking about the spur that I almost missed the egg corridor. If you remember way back, the original plan from Sue herself was to hatch the dragon egg and fly off the island, so that's supposed to be our clue to go here. That said, it's pretty obvious that this is where you're supposed to go, as it's the only location that has changed when you return to it. The egg corridor has exploded, and it's not clear how. This is perhaps a ramification of almost killing the core of the island, but other than that, I can't think of anything. Throughout this level, you can see the corpses of dragons that didn't survive the explosion, and some that seem to just be barely clinging onto life. The concept of returning to a previously explored area only for it to have changed really resonates with me. It's something I always enjoy when included in a game, and this time it's no different. Mimiga Village being deserted was a more indirect way of showing that the island was going to shit, but the egg corridor is a much more immediate example. Skipping ahead to what used to be the egg observation room, we find a few missiles and our next boss fight. The sisters are a stupidly easy fight that serves as a nice breather compared to the pure difficulty of the core and the self-imposed difficulty of Ironhead. All you have to do is wait for one of them to open their mouth and then fire at them. Interesting fact about the sisters, throughout the egg corridor we can see that there are 15 dragons scattered throughout this level, and with there only being 16 eggs, it means that the sisters must have hatched from the same egg, making them twins as well. Another interesting fact is you can actually completely skip this fight if you choose not to open the treasure chest. For the remainder of the egg corridor, I've decided to show off the packaging of the Switch version for K's story. Certain pre-orders came with a keychain of either Curly, Quote, or Balrog. If anyone watching this has a Curly keychain, hit me up in my Twitter DM so we can make some sort of deal. This artwork is beautiful, but there's also a bunch of neat little Easter eggs on this reversible cover, like the date, which has the freeware release of the game. There's a mini CD that has the Famatrax remix of the music on it. Never listened to it myself though, since my PC doesn't have a disk drive. Finally, there's the manual, which is 100% in color and has a ton of great artwork inside. I gotta be honest though, I'm not a fan of the big head design they gave Curly and Mr. Traveler here. At the end of the book, there's a guide instructing players on how to get the best ending. They don't tell you outright though, you have to hold up the page against the light to decode a secret message, which I think is cute. Returning to the game, we can see that Kazuma has beaten us to the dragon egg. Turns out Sue was right, he was able to figure out how to hatch it. He explains that in the time while we were gone, Misery appeared and finally managed to grab Sue. Amidst the chaos, Kazuma was somehow able to escape to the egg corridor and hatch the dragon as planned. With everyone he knows taken by the doctor, he's given up all hope of being able to defeat him and bringing everything back to normal. He plans to escape the island on the flying dragon and offers to take you with him. If you say yes, you get the worst ending and leave the fate of the world in the doctor's hands. If you say no, the game continues. Taking Kazuma's offer would leave far too much unfinished business. We've come this far, we can go a little more. Following Kazuma, we're led out to the outer wall. This is the first time in the game where we're outside, and it comes at the absolute lowest point in the story. Kazuma has given up hope. All the Mimiga we know are either dead or captured. Whether Curly is alive or not is unknown. The Doctor's plans are all going perfectly and are about to come to fruition. If the first act of Cave Story ends when you're sent to the Labyrinth, then reaching the outer wall is the end of Cave Story's second act. Traditionally, 3-act structures see the heroes at their lowest point at the end of the second act, so hopefully you can see what I mean by this. If I had to pick any location or moment to think of when I think Cave Story, it's this one. The scenery is absolutely magnificent. I never get tired of seeing those clouds fly by. The track, aptly titled Moon Song, is probably my favorite track from this game as well. It starts out as a somber minimalist tune, which becomes more boisterous as it progresses. It's incredibly fitting. When we first hear the track, all the chips seem to be stacked against us, but as we keep climbing the wall, it becomes clear that despite everything, we can still succeed. I also don't think it's a coincidence Pixel decided to use verticality here. The direction up is commonly associated with good feelings, and what I think Pixel is trying to convey with this is that once the outer wall is conquered, things can only look up from then on. If I have one complaint about this section, it's a selfish one. I wish it was just a little longer. We hardly get through one pass through of the song. Immediately after heading back inside, we're introduced to a new character. This cowardly man is named Ito. He was part of the expedition Sue, the Doctor, and whatnot were a part of, and like Sue, was turned into a Mimiga by Misery. Up until this point, Ito isn't brought up by any other member of the expedition, so I wouldn't be surprised if someone assumed that he was going to pull a fast one from under us, but nah, he's genuine. He'll be more important later, but in the meantime, it's off to the biggest area in the game, the Plantation. The Plantation uses the title theme as its background music. It gives the place this feeling of coming full circle. After this place, there's not much more to go. In a corner of the plantation, we actually find Curly lying in a bed. One of the Cthulhus is looking after her after she washed up in the water to the left of here. Sadly, things aren't going so great with Curly. She doesn't seem to remember anything about us or anything in general. We'll make sure to solve this later, but right now there's nothing we can do for her. Across the plantation, we can see all sorts of Mimiga gardening. Somehow, the Doctor has convinced the masses that they need to harvest the red flowers to defend themselves from an incoming invasion. Not all of the Mimiga believe this. In fact, all the ones we've met before are wise to this scheme, but are ultimately powerless to stop him anyway. The Doctor is essentially having the Mimiga dig their own graves here. It's horrifically evil. Speaking of the Doctor, his character is pretty much just that, smart and evil. His sole motivation being wanting to take over the world is quite the cliche, but I think he manages to sell just how evil he is based on cruelty alone. If players want to defeat the Doctor, then that means he did his job as a villain, regardless of how cliche he might be. Although this may not be as simple as it seems. As a level, the Plantation is fairly different from any other level we've seen before. Up to this point, they've all been straightforward, requiring some backtracking at times, but there was a clear beginning and end to the level. It's not as cut and dry in the Plantation. We're thrown into a huge sandbox and encouraged to explore and find the end ourselves. It's a change of pace that I think helps keep the Plantation standing out. Another thing that helps it stand out is the lack of combat in this place. There are some enemies, but for the most part, you're going to be talking to NPCs rather than shooting the spur. Trying to escape the Plantation leads to us getting thrown in jail. Inside the jail, there's the familiar large Mimiga, who explains that this place is where the Mimiga who oppose the Doctor are sent to. Sue used to be in this jail cell as well, but was carried away before we could meet her again. Before she left though, she slipped a letter into Mr. Traveler's inventory. The letter has a lot of information we already knew and or can infer, but there's a couple interesting nuggets still inside. For one, Sue writes a small tidbit about the Demon Crown's origin, explaining that it once belonged to the master of the island. And the other bit of info is a lead to where we have to go next. Sue believes that her mom is still alive and can help us in stopping the Doctor. We can find her tucked away in a room guarded by a hidden pass-through. Sue's mom, Momorin Sakamoto, is the last member of the expedition that we meet, and she manages to make a lasting impression with what little time she gets. Momorin is incredibly sardonic with not just her dialogue, but also her mugshot. There's a lot of similarities in the way Momorin and Sue act that it's clear she's Sue's mother. Something that kinda confuses me about Momorin's behavior though is it seems like she isn't taking the situation very seriously. She knows everything the Doctor is planning and was even apparently thrown off the island by the guy. Her thoughts on this action are to call it not very nice. Regardless of her tone, she's still willing to help and has even built us a rocket to take up to the Doctor's throne. The rocket still needs some extra parts, so she sends us out to go pick those up. One thing I find underutilized about this section of the game is the removal of the Booster 2.0. Momorin takes the gadget because she needs it to finish building the rocket, so when we're scrounging up the supplies, we have to do it boosterless. Despite only having the booster for a short while, it's incredibly easy to rely on it to make simple platforming that much more of a breeze. So for it to be taken away, even for such a short time, makes me feel naked. I don't even think adding a challenging platforming section would be the right answer though, since once the Plantation is over, that's what the remainder of this game is. But some more exploration of this idea couldn't hurt. If you've never done it before, I highly recommend going to all the Mimiga in this area and talking to them with the mask on. One of the Mimiga, an older one named Zet, recounts his experience with the army of killer robots that set afoot on this island years ago, saying that some of them appeared to have a heart and soul. After obtaining the sprinkler, Momorin instructs us to find Ito and bring him over to put the finishing touches on the rocket. Now, this is an incredibly loose theory I have, so take it with a grain of salt. Sue's mom is accounted for, but there's never any mention of a father. It's likely he passed away before the events of the game, or just didn't join the expedition, but I have another idea. If Sue takes after her mother, then it's fair to say that Kazuma would take after his father. Kazuma actually shares a lot of characteristics with Ito of all people. They're both smart and cowardly. Do I think this was intentional? No, not really. If there was maybe something more connecting Ito to the Sakamoto family, like a throwaway line about an old fling they had, I could probably argue it was deliberate, but there isn't. In fact, at one point in the game, you can see how Ito looks as a human, and his appearance isn't exactly similar to Kazuma, so I'll leave it at that. After taking a quick rest, we can see Momorin and the rocket are missing. Going outside to investigate shows that Momorin has completed the rocket with the help of Ito, but also that all the Mimiga have been rounded up, and the Doctor is about to begin the final step of his plan. She gives us the booster back in exchange for the Mimiga mask, but if you were really daring, you could play the rest of the game without making this exchange. So I guess consider what I said earlier about taking the booster away a mulligan. All of the enemies are gone too, meaning that the ogres guarding the teleporters are now unaccounted for as well, allowing us to explore more. In a good nod of continuity, there's actually a teleporter that goes to the shack in the Bushlands, implying that's how Kazuma got trapped inside of there. We're going to be using a different teleporter, however. You see, we still need to help out Curly. Her memory is gone, but the Cthulhu says that there's actually a mushroom which cures memory loss when eaten. It's up to us to figure out exactly where that mushroom is, but it should be fairly obvious that it's the graveyard. If you remember from the beginning of the playthrough, there were a ton of mushrooms in the area and an unreachable door. The teleporter we were stopped from entering earlier leads us back to Arthur's house, which gives us a fairly straightforward shot back to the graveyard. With the booster, we're able to reach that door and find the mushroom known as Ma Pignon inside. Ma Pignon requires us to answer a few trick questions before he'll decide to help us save our friend. The questions aren't really hard to answer, but they can definitely trip you up if you read them too fast, like me. The penalty for answering one of the questions wrong is less than the slap on the wrist though. Answering all of the questions correctly gives us the mushroom badge. Which actually isn't what we need at all. We have to talk to Ma Pignon again, which will initiate a fight. Ma Pignon may be a tiny mushroom, but that's no reason to underestimate him. In fact, that's one of the reasons why he's kinda tough. Out of all the bosses in the game, Ma Pignon is probably the hardest to hit due to his size. On top of that, he has lengthy moments during the fight where he's just plain invincible. His damage output is pitiful, but he can send down falling rocks which deal their usual 10 points of damage, which is what you really have to watch out for. As much as I love the spur, it may have bit me in the ass a tad during this fight, as I would constantly charge shots only for Ma Pignon's iframes to render the process useless. I didn't die fighting Ma Pignon, but I came incredibly close because I was playing too recklessly. With Mushroom in hand, it's time to talk to Curly again, and she's gonna have a lot to say, so I'll just let her do the talking. Finally, I can stop calling Quote Mr. Traveler. So Curly and Quote were robots sent to the island to put an end to the Demon Crown, as opposed to the other killer robots who wanted to harness it. This is as much confirmation as you can get that Curly and Quote are the robots with a heart and soul. Curly also mentions in her story that they fought a wielder of the Demon Crown. This wielder of the Demon Crown is never mentioned by name, but it's widely presumed to be the third one to do so, Miyakato, due to how the timeline adds up. One last detour to talk to one of Jenka's dogs before we tackle the home stretch. Since the dog mentions Curly, we can infer this one is Hajime. Hajime not only gives us a life capsule, but we also receive our second life pot if we happen to use the first one. Like last time, we will be using our life pot for a very special occasion. When riding on the rocket, you want to keep still. If you're a little too fidgety, it's actually possible to get squished by one of the presses. I should know, it happened to me. Before entering the last cave, all of your weapons are dropped to their level 1 power. If I didn't have the spur, this would be much more of a hindrance, but since I do have it, this doesn't affect me much. The last cave functions as a primer for testing your skills with the Booster 2.0. You get a different version of the last cave depending on which booster you grabbed beforehand. Up until this point, there wasn't really any platforming section that could use the Booster 2.0 to its full potential, since Pixel had to take into account the scenario where players grabbed the 0.8. There's one more area in the game like this, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm not exactly the best at showing off what the Booster 2.0 can do. For example, I constantly hold down the button to propel myself when I could go further if I tapped it repeatedly. There's also a move you can do where you glide across the ground with the booster, then jump off the ground, carrying the momentum of the booster with you, allowing for some incredible speed. I don't have much more to say about the last cave, except for the boss at the end, so allow me to talk about the music for a bit. For the most part, I've neglected to talk about the music save for a few exceptions, but for all those unaware, all the tracks were composed by Pixel. In fact, he didn't just compose the tracks, he also created his own music software to compose the tracks on, called Org Maker. On top of that, Pixel appears to be all self-taught when it comes to composition. Danny Baranovsky, the original composer to games like The Binding of Isaac and Super Meat Boy, composed one of the remix soundtracks for the game, and commented on the structure of the songs. Likening it to something alien as opposed to typical music theory, Danny said, and I quote, "It's really good, but it doesn't make any goddamn sense." And yet, despite it not following those rules, the soundtrack to K-Story is universally acclaimed. Perhaps this is why a lot of the remix soundtracks don't end up doing much for me. Pixel and only Pixel knew what sounded right when and where. I provided the article where Danny talks about this in the description. It's more of a general interview, so Cave Story only comes up a little, but it's a unique perspective on the soundtrack of Cave Story coming from an industry professional. We're coming up to the end of the last cave, which ends in the fight with a creature known as the Red Ogre. This fight is only available to you from this version of the cave, otherwise there is no fight. The Red Ogre himself is kind of a pushover, but what's really significant about this fight is his lore. The Red Ogre is the same Red Ogre that Arthur defeated years ago when defending Mimiga Village. Jack the Mimiga has some dialogue that explains the situation much earlier in the game. The most interesting thing about the Red Ogre is there's actually an unobtainable item that proves that this is the same ogre Arthur fought. The item is called the Beast Fang, and it's located in Yamashita Farm on the same space as a block, meaning the only way to access it is through Hex Editor. Due to the ogre appearing to be missing one of his fangs, it's safe to say that when Arthur defeated the Red Ogre all those years ago, he took out its fang as well. The only snag in this theory is I can't think of a reason why Pixel would make this item unobtainable if all the other pieces tying it together are still present in the game. It's not removed in any of the re-releases, so I guess it's just a little cameo for people who dig into the games. Perhaps it could have also been swapped out for the medal of the Red Ogre. They're both do-nothing items, so perhaps Pixel decided having both of them was redundant and decided to stick with the medal. Finally, we reached the top of the island, the balcony. This is the location where the expedition first landed, as is evident by the helicopter and the prefab house. There's a nice bit of continuity here too. As you can see, it's now morning as opposed to nighttime when at the outer wall. In the lead up to the doctor, we have to face some enraged Mimiga. You want to play safe when fighting these guys, as we're going to be going through a bit of a gauntlet of boss fights soon, and the healthier we are for that, the better. In case you couldn't refill your weapon energy through the last cave, there's a little cache of experience, health, and missiles you can find if you scale to the top of the island. If you go up a little further, then this point the game cuts to black, giving you a message which says end of road, then sends you back to the exit of the last cave. However, if you jump off the side of the mountain, you die, getting a "you were never heard from again" message. You get the same treatment when jumping off from the outer wall, I just neglected to mention it then. I collect enough XP to max the level on my missiles, but I hardly use the damn things because I exclusively use the spur. It's kind of a problem I have. The spur is so good it ends up being all I use, even if another item would suit the situation better. We're heading down now to begin the boss gauntlet. The first boss we need to fight is Misery, who you fight in the same room from the opening of the game. We've been building up to a battle against Misery since at least the Sand Zone, and while she's harder than the next two fights, she's still kinda easy. Like Ma Pignon, the bulk of the difficulty you'll face when fighting Misery comes from just trying to land a hit on her. As long as you're patient when trying to land your shots, you should be able to avoid her attacks with ease. The one that's probably the hardest to dodge are the black orbs, which become lightning bolts when below them. Depending on how high they are off the ground, avoiding them can be simple as just walking, but I usually just use the booster to blaze through them. Near the end though, you can see I try to pass by them too early and get punished for it. By the time Misery has the 4 black circles surrounding her, she can be extremely hard to hit when putting all your time and effort into one attack, which, dare I say, is a downside to the spur. The first fight is down, but we still got a few more to go. Thankfully, we got a couple of breather fights before the real shit begins. The King's Table has the same eye motif as the Demon Crown, as well as familiar imprisoned Mimiga like Chaco and Santa. It's hard not to read their dialogue as deadpan, especially Chie, that little Mimiga next to Chaco. The Doctor uses the power of the red crystal, not to just fire off energy blasts, but also to block fully charged spur shots, making him similarly annoying to the way Misery was when you used the spur. Thankfully, unlike Misery, his damage output is pitiful and the red crystal's protection is situational at best. He'll teleport around like in the Misery fight, but the red crystal gives away where his location is going to be. The double helix red blasts he fire are incredibly easy to dodge with the Booster 2.0. The hardest move of the Doctor's to dodge is when he unleashes a horde of the red blasts that ricochet across the room. The best way to dodge this is to head as far away from the Doctor as possible, since they disappear after a short while. Even then, they only deal 5 damage each, which at this point in the game isn't too much. Muscle Doctor is probably on par with the Doctor in terms of difficulty. His damage output is more respectable, but his pattern for attacks is much more shallow, and the moves he does have are pretty damn hard to get hit by if you play cautiously. The best and coolest move he has is the one where he fires the horde of bats, which can take you by surprise and land a couple of cheap shots on you. Otherwise, nah, he's easy. By this point though, the tiny mistakes I've amassed by fighting 3 bosses in a row are starting to add up, and all of the fights have just been the warm-up. Before we go up to the final room, we can talk to Santa and Chie. Their dialogue is pretty shallow, but talking to Chaco reveals that Sue is still MIA, which isn't a very good sign. You would think that'd be all you can do, but talking to Chaco for a second time nabs a heartwarming surprise that serves as a good pick-me-up for the fight ahead. If you are really quick, it might be possible to pick up all 6 hearts, but 10 HP gained from practically nothing isn't anything to scoff at. Upon entering the black space, which is a very ominous name for the record, we rediscover the core, which is still intact but has lost its original color. The Doctor's mind remained intact, and has not only possessed the undead core, but given Misery a dreadful new form and Sue a fursuit. This fight is rarely 3 fights at once, which is as difficult as one might expect. The undead core functions as a large body, dictating where the fight will be located. Misery spawns an unprecedented amount of enemies on screen, building up tons of clutter, and Sue goes up in your face in attempts to melee you. Although you only need to defeat the undead core to finish the fight, taking out at least Misery first is recommended since she's probably the most annoying to have around. With all the enemies she spawns, it's only natural that a few would slip between the cracks, so to speak, and chip away a bit of your health. It's death from 1,000 cuts, and since you've most likely already sustained a bit of damage from the previous 3 fights, those are cuts you can't afford to take. The one upside to all the enemies Misery sends your way is they're capable of dropping HP, so assuming you're able to dodge with impeccable accuracy, you could end this fight with more HP than when you entered it. Since Sue has the least amount of health, she usually is the first to go down, even if you're not focusing your attacks on her. You can actually pass through Sue and Misery without being hurt, which ties together to make Sue a pretty big pushover. She only deals a little more damage than Misery's attacks too, if her extremely telegraphed kicks land. Keeping Misery alive leads to my downfall, but it at least lets me talk about the cutscene skip command Nicholas added to the Switch version. I actually didn't know this even existed until the Doctor fight prior, and while it seems like a bit of a hack job, it does what it says on the tin. Maybe you also noticed that when we defeated Misery a little bit ago, instead of teleporting away, she flew up. I imagine this was because she wanted to head straight to the core, as to her, it's the most important thing on the island. Despite this being one of the last bosses of the game, I don't know if I'd consider it harder than the original core fight, at least if you're trying to get the spur and the best ending. Your kit at that stage in the game is so lopsided compared to the difficulty of the enemies you face, by endgame you're vastly more prepared and, dare I say, overpowered. I've said it before, and I'll probably say it again before this commentary is over, but the mobility the Booster 2.0 offers cannot be understated. It's so important in the late game, it's not even funny. The bulk of my deaths from the original core fight came from the limited movement options. If I had even the 0.8, then the fight could have been easier, but that would have made this fight much harder as a result. One thing the undead core has over the original fight though, is the wear and tear you have to go through before even getting to it. If you were patient enough, you could grind HP in the Labyrinth so you face the boss at full HP. At the end of the day though, I'd say the core is probably the hardest fight on its own. Think of it this way. I beat the undead core on my second attempt after almost beating it on my first try. The original core took a handful of tries before I barely eked out a victory. I think I enjoy doing this fight more though, as the original core fight can be a slog when using the Polar Star. Maybe next playthrough I'll try out the Snake, see how that fares. With Misery and Sue out of commission, the undead core becomes a much more manageable fight. A couple of well-placed spur shots later, and it's defeated. Sue's possession was merely temporary, so following her lead, it's time to hightail it off the island before it collapses. You get a full HP recovery after defeating the undead core, and you want to make sure you have every last point of it. If you continue going left at the balcony, you can get the normal ending, but since we've not only acquired the Booster 2.0, but also the Iron Bond from Curly, we can head to the secret final area of the game by going inside the prefab house. If you get hit from one of the falling rocks on your way to the house, I'd honestly recommend resetting unless you want to challenge yourself. Trust me though, this level is challenging enough. Welcome to the Bloodstained Sanctuary. This level is what all of our efforts were for. As the sign might suggest, this area is far and away the most difficult part of the game. Pixel knew that only those who had gotten a good handle on the mechanics of Cave Story would be able to make it to this part, so he threw everything at the player this time, no holding back. The first part of the Sanctuary really tests your fuel reservation for the booster. Holding down the jump button will get you stuck at the very first roadblock. I made sure to practice this area specifically before recording this playthrough, but I still screw up at the beginning a couple of times because of poor ammo management. On your first pass through of the sanctuary, you will be periodically stopped by dialogue boxes elaborating on the man known as Balos, Jenka's sister. The first passages should actually be familiar to the more attentive viewers, as it's the same text that appeared after defeating the core. Much like the last cave, all of our weapons have been dropped to level 1. However, unlike the last cave, I will be making sure that we have level 3 missiles for the final boss. They're kind of important. We can see Curly Brace lying down a little out of it. You actually can't proceed without taking Curly, not that I think anyone will leave her there, especially after all they've done to save her before. Basement 2 of the Bloodstained Sanctuary is probably my least favorite screen in the game. It seems kinda weird to be so candid about it, but this part is so egregious I can't ignore it. The falling rocks deal their regular 10 HP and fall at random. When their hitbox is active, is hard to pinpoint exactly. At first I thought they dealt no damage after they hit the ground once, but from what I understand now, they appear to not hurt Quote in that small moment when they bounce up a tad after the first impact, then deal damage when they fall again. On top of all this, Buttes, the little angel kids, are constantly swarming you, pressuring you not to take your time. I wouldn't have a problem with this if it was easier to dodge the blocks, either by reducing the frequency in which they fall, or cutting out the RNG entirely. I'd lean more towards the former, as I'm alright with being kept on my toes, but the amount that drop make it far too difficult to avoid taking loads of damage. If you were really desperate, you could grab those 2 hearts in the corner and then switch screens constantly to recoup the damage you took during the second part of the level. However though, playing reserved in this section of the level usually nets you a large amount of HP anyway, so I don't find myself ever doing this. It breaks the pace a lot. For the remainder of the level, we have Curly assisting us with the Nemesis, a weapon like the Spur in that it screws around with the leveling system. The Nemesis grows weaker if you collect experience for it. Its level 3 form actually just shoots out rubber ducks. However, at first level, it's quite the powerhouse. You can obtain this weapon by trading the blade away in a little side quest, but I usually don't like to do that, if only because I feel like I'd be doing wrong by King. It's also pretty damn hard to avoid picking up experience. Either because of bad luck or just muscle memory, I never end up using the Nemesis much. This weapon is perfect for Curly to use though, as she can't collect any XP. At points, you'll see me opting to use Curly's long-range Nemesis over waiting to charge my Spur. This level can appear very daunting to first-time players, but just remember that a lot of it comes down to practice. I think it took me a few days worth of tries before I was first able to beat this level. By the time I made it to the end, my hands were shaking. Besides the health tip I gave earlier, another tip I give is to just take your time. If you picked up the 290 counter from the outer wall, you may be tempted to blast through this level as fast as you can, but you gotta learn how to walk before you can run. For example, the buttes that fly out from the floor and ceiling appear once you reach a specific tile on the map. Memorizing what that tile is can help you better prepare for their seemingly random appearance. Also, be aware that they are invulnerable until they're done flying out of their spawner. Some of the more annoying enemies to fight are the buttes, which fire arrows. They're usually in spots where they're hard to hit, like shown right now, and on top of that deal a disgustingly high 8 HP worth of damage. These moments in particular make me kinda wish I had the snake, so I wouldn't have to be as precise with my firing. When it comes to the music, Pixel really managed to outdo himself with this track, Running Hell. The song slowly builds up to an absolute headbanger of a climax. It's incredible. Part of the reason I didn't mind constantly dying in this level was because I loved the song that much. Right before the end of the level, we're given those 24 missiles I mentioned way back. Pixel probably intended for you to use those missiles on the upcoming fight, but I wanted to make sure my supply was as high as can be for the final boss. Before him though, we have a quick fight with the Heavy Press. Cave Story veterans might notice something a little different and strange with this battle. A little bit of the area outside the Heavy Press boss room is still visible in the corner. I believe the reason for this is because Cave Story on Switch is widescreen, and without altering the level design, this was an unfortunate quirk from the decision. Something similar to this is present in the Omega fight, but it's much less noticeable. I forgot to show this off earlier, but this room is actually accessible from the Plantation through the door on the left. If you head to the statue room from the Plantation, an ogre will be putting the finishing touches on the doctor statue. I find the designs of the previous wearers of the Demon Crown to be particularly interesting. None of them appear to be human outside of the Doctor. These statues also give a lot of history to the crown without actually saying a lot. The amount of previous wearers of the Demon Crown before let us fill in the blanks over how much time has passed since the Demon Crown's creation. It could be 100 years, it could be 1,000 years. It's never explicitly said, but I like to believe that it was this dog who was telling us the story of Balos in the Sanctuary, and all the way back at the core room. It told us Balos' story because it believed Quote was strong enough to beat him once and for all. One could possibly argue that Balos comes out of nowhere, but I don't necessarily believe that's true. His full backstory may be dumped on us minutes before actually meeting him, but we're made aware of his existence about halfway through the game, provided you grab the tow rope. I also don't think Pixel expected players to figure out about Balos on their first playthrough, like what I said about the Booster 2.0. When I said that I think the Doctor was intentionally made to be a cliché bad guy, I think it was to help contrast with the more depressing, sympathetic Balos. To give a short recap, Balos was a man loved by everyone in his little kingdom. This love made the King of the Land jealous, so he imprisoned and tortured Balos as punishment. Balos retaliated in anger, turning the entire kingdom into ash, alongside his wife and child. Jenka sealed him away, but eventually Misery found out about Balos and ordered him to make the Demon Crown, which he did, but Misery paid the price by having to serve its master. The progression from the creator of the Demon Crown, a genuinely good man pushed too far, to its most recent wearer, a power-hungry egomaniac, makes for good contrast. The actual fight with Balos is similar to the Undead Core, in that its difficulty comes from the trek to the boss, and not necessarily the boss in particular. Your worst nightmare in this fight is probably going to be nerves, since getting to Balos in one shot is so daunting your first time successfully doing so. But once you get a bit of practice in, you can see that Balos himself is a fairly predictable fight. His first form is as simple as flying over him in the booster. His second form is a little more complicated. You want to shoot in between his eyes. This can be a little harder than you think, as the hitboxes for the eyes are more narrow than they lead on. The trick to this form, though, is to wait until Balos has jumped 3 times, then land on his side right next to his eyes, then fire a fully charged spur shot. This should only take a few volleys before he's done for. The design of Balos' second and third form leave a bit to be desired, though. I'm not sure what Pixel was going for here, and the music is also a tad disappointing. It's just the Undead Core theme reused, making the original core the only fight in the game with a unique boss theme. I think it would have gone a long way to hear a unique theme for Balos, and I'm disappointed that isn't the case. The final form of Balos involves juggling between fighting incoming buttes and trying to hit his eyes. The design for this form I actually kinda like. The skulls oozing out of his form come off as quite sinister. However, we won't be seeing too much of this form, as there's a way to easily defeat it. So that's it. Cave Story's over. In case it wasn't clear from me doing a 2-hour commentary on it, this is one of my favorite games ever. The fact that this game was completed entirely by one man is astounding to me still. Almost everything done in this game, level design, control, music, art direction, and story are done so well it's truly incredible. Pixel really is an inspiration to indie developers around the world. The team at Nicalis also deserve a round of applause as well. A lot of people seem to give Nicalis a hard time for some things, but at the end of the day, if it wasn't for them, I, and I'm sure many others, would have never played Cave Story in the first place. If you want to play Cave Story, please go to cavestory.org. I've linked it in the description. The original version of the game is available there for free. Try it out, and if you found yourself enjoying it, then I'd have to recommend the Switch port as a definitive version of the game. It's a little pricey, but it has a lot of great quality of life changes that make the game that much better. I don't have much more to say about the game. I've practically talked to death about it at this point, so I think I'll leave it there. I'm positive there's a load of details I missed in this commentary, but I hope this served as a fun tour of this amazing world at the least. Alongside Pixel, I'd like to thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time.